turn the meeting over to Zita. Go ahead
Okay,
and
so
let me
you're
know when
still
you need to advance slides.
okay. Yeah, I'll let you know when we need advanced slides. So what you just said makes me feel like a lot of pressure. Ideas. Okay, so Elizabeth Kahanu Kalaniana Ole Woods is the person I will be sharing information with you about. So if you go to the next slide, please. Elizabeth Kahanu Ka'auvae was born on Makawao, Maui on March 8th, 1878. And I just realized just now that's my mom's birthday also, but she's not as old. So she was born on Maui. So next slide. Her father was George Kalevohi Ka'ovai, a member of a Maui Ali'i family. Her mother was Ulalia Mu'olu Ke'ave Heulu La'anui, also from a family of chiefly rank. This is their headstone, which is actually at Kahanu Church. She was also a direct descendant of Kaneo'oneo, an Oahu chief. He has connections to Kauai Ali'i. So next slide. When her father died in March of 1881, so she is then 3, she was hanai by her cousin Kapi'olani. Kapi'olani's maternal grandfather was Kekaulike, a Maui chief. Kapi'olani is connected to Kamuali'i, a Kauai chief, and the chief I was mentioning that is connected to Oahu and Kauai. I was going down a little bit of a rabbit hole trying to find out what the degree of relationship was between Kapi'olani and Elizabeth. And I realized I needed to stop doing it because this is only the first 3 slides of the presentation and I needed just to move on. But Kapi'olani was one of her cousins. So next slide. When her dad died, she was sent to Oahu under the care of her cousin Kapi'olani, but she wasn't living with Kapi'olani. She was enrolled at the Sacred Hearts Convent. The photo at the top left is Our Lady of Peace Cathedral. You can see the front door that fronts off of 4th Street. You can see the front door again, fancied up in the photo on the right with the Sacred Hearts Convent behind or makai of the church. What you see in the bottom slide are 5 bays of the Sacred Hearts Convent that still exist there today. So this is where she was enrolled at age 3. This is kind of like Lidi Okalani being sent to the Chief School, Children's School at age 4. I was not able to find a lot of details or any details for that matter, other than the fact that it was a boarding school. So next slide, please. Actually, it was boarding school and other school. So one of my big questions was, where did she and Kohio actually meet? Next slide. So the stories go that they met when he was imprisoned in 1895. He had been involved in a counter-revolution to try to restore Lidi Okalani to the throne, and he got arrested. And a lot of the stories say that's where they met. But I wonder, because she was Hanai basically to Kapi'olani, and he and his siblings were Hanai to Kapi'olani after their mother died, there must have been family parties, family events, family gatherings where they met and got to know each other before he was in prison. And it looks as if she and other young ladies were going to the prison to take food to and to entertain and to talk to their the men that were in prison, which is kind of a real relaxed, lackadaisical attitude on the part of the Republic of Hawaii, for which I'm really grateful. So next slide. After his release, they were married at St. Andrew's Church. This is I don't think it looked like this when they got married because it has much more, it wasn't as completed as this image says. However, the source that I got this from says this was how the church looked in 1896. So next slide. This is an image of Prince Kohio. Kohio was a son of Kekaulike, Kapi'olani's sister, and Jonah Kohio from Kauai. Next slide. I'm wondering where my notes went. This is Kapi'olani Maternity Home. So after Kapi'olani died, Princess, then she was then called Princess Kalaniana Ole, became president of the trustees of the Kapi'olani Maternity Home. This is a position that she held until she died. And if you're looking at the information and stories about Kapi'olani Maternity Home, she and the trustees were constantly having to meet because they were having a lot of financial problems, but they were also always finding ways to solve it. This was originally a home that belonged to her, the woman that would have been her mother-in-law, had her mother-in-law not died when she was about 4. So next slide, please. In 1890, she and Prince Kohio, or Prince Kalanianaole as he was then known, entertained friends at their home in March before leaving for the mainland. This was a tour that was a trip that was to last a little over 2 years. When they were in San Francisco, the Sunday Call interviewed Kalanianaole, and he said basically the last 3 years have sadly changed Hawaii. The great influx of immigration has brought many undesirable people to our shores. Where once we lived in a free and easy life with our doors and windows wide open, bolts and dar- sorry, bolts and bars are now necessary. Strange customs are stamping out our enjoyments, and the curse of money making is taking all the poetry out of life. He had not been happy since annexation, and because Hawaii had gone money making mad. So he told the Call he can't stand it, so I've left it, and I doubt I shall ever go back to Hawaii again. This Sunday Call did not talk to Princess Kalanianaole, so we don't know what her attitude was about that. So next slide, please. He did not have to worry about finances because he and his brother, David Kawananakoa, had an inheritance of about had an inheritance from his auntie Kapi'olani, worked out to about $15,765,695 if you do an inflation calculation into today's money. These are 2 images or photographs of them that appeared in that San Francisco newspaper. I think a very handsome couple. Next slide. Amongst the places they visited was they actually had planned originally on going to Washington, D.C. to visit his auntie Lili Okalani. I did research looking in the Washington, D.C. District of Columbia papers and some of the East Coast newspapers to find out when they were there and whether they met, when they met, and maybe what they talked about. And there doesn't seem to have been any coverage of their stop in Washington, D.C. that year. When they went on to Europe, they visited the Paris Exposition. He was not impressed, and we don't know what her attitude again is because, again, the newspapers did not apparently talk to her or didn't feel her comments were worth covering. They visited London, Ireland, Scotland, and decided they were going to visit the continent all the way down to Naples and then sail for the Transvaal. So next slide. The Transvaal is that section in South Africa that is on the upper right-hand side. And this is at a time when the Boer War was going on, B-O-R-E war. This was a war between the Dutch settlers and the British settlers. They were trying to decide who should have primary control over South Africa and the resources of South Africa, which included a lot of diamonds. They traveled to South Africa with Sir Samori Vine. He was on a government mission, and they were allowed to travel with him because no one else was going to be traveling there because of all the fighting. So if you go to the next slide. Cape Town is in the lower left-hand side of the coastline, on the left-hand side of the screen. They traveled from Cape Town to Kimberley. They traveled from Kimberley to Port St. Lucie. They traveled from Port St. Lucie to Port St. Lucie. They traveled from Port St. Lucie to Port St. Lucie. They traveled from Port St. Lucie to Port St. Lucie. They traveled from Cape Town to Kimberley. They traveled from Cape Town to Kimberley. which is almost right in the middle. Kimberley is where there were a lot of diamond mines. As they were traveling, they ran into some of the fighting, and their escort saw a wounded man that was Dutch and approached him to help him out. And the wounded man actually drew a gun and attempted to shoot their escort. So their escort shot him and then confiscated the guy's equipment. So if you go to the next slide, amongst the equipment that he confiscated is this whip that was made with rhinoceros hide. He presented that as a gift to Princess Kalanianaole. So I'd really love to find out what happened to that gift. This is the princess and the prince. This is a later photograph. So they go on to Kimberley, and if you go to the next slide, so actually back, just stay there for a minute. But when they were in Kimberley, they visited diamond mines, and she was given a gift of a rough cut diamond, a small rough cut diamond that had the shape of a woman's face, not a woman's face, but a face. You could see the hairline, you could see the chin, you could see even the mustache and the eyes. In the Hawaiian, in the local, and one of the things that I was really disappointed about in trying to figure out where they all went for this trip is, unlike Kalakawa's trip in 1881 and Liliuokalani and Kapi'olani's trip to England, the local newspapers didn't have a lot of coverage, simply because either they were not writing letters home or they were, and the newspapers didn't feel like they were going to cover it. But one of the stories that I did find is in the Auckland Daily News. This was a link from some other website. They visited there in September of 1901. They visited the lake region, and these are images from that story in the Auckland Weekly News. I think she was a very beautiful young woman at that point, because one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is she married Jonah Kohil at age 17. So next slide. When they returned to Honolulu in September of 1901, one of the things that the local newspaper said, he brought several kangaroos for his collection. And he must have had a collection like a zoo. Don't know what happened to those kangaroos, whether they survived or whether they got moved on someplace else. This is a scan of a photograph that is in our attic collection. The back of the photograph says Puelelani, which is a home he inherited from his auntie Kapi'olani. It was a home in the Waikiki area where Kohiu Beach now sits. So if you go to the next slide. These are outside images of the home. Again, these are Bishop Museum photographs that show what the home looked like on the outside. So next slide. This is an interior of the house. And if you've been to the palace or are familiar with the palace, you might recognize some of the things that were inside this home. The tusk on the left is an elephant tusk that was attached to a table that's now in our music room. There is a calabash in the foreground that apparently has the Kaumakapili on it. Kaumakapili calabash was a gift to Kalakaua, which meant it went to Kapi'olani, which then meant it ended up with Kohil and his wife. This is a calabash that is now on display in our blue room. Next slide. This is another view of the same room. There is the wind gourd of Laoma'oma'u in the middle that was also inherited from Kapi'olani, from Kalakaua via Kapi'olani, that is now part of the Bishop Museum collection. So if you go to the next slide. This is a photo of a room in their home, and you see Princess Kahanu, Kalanianaole, on the right. She looks like she's doing some work. So next slide is a close-up of her. And again, that next slide. So there she is again. She was, at this time, still doing a lot of work with the Kapi'olani Maternity Home. I kind of wonder who was responsible for the home when she was on her trip around the world. But she was very much involved in everything and anything to do to take care of that maternity home. Next slide. So this is the circular sofa. The upper right hand corner, left hand, sorry, I'm getting my directionals confused. Upper left-hand corner is an image of the throne room in 1882. Some of the furniture was removed by Iolani when Kalakaua died. That circular sofa ended up in the Kalanianaole home. This is the princess sitting on the sofa in her house. Jim Bartels told us when I was training at the palace that they loved it to death. So they took it apart and they sent it to the dump instead of trying to restore it or fix it. So when we restored the throne room, we had to recreate that circular sofa, which you see now in this newer image of the throne room. So you can kind of look at the background in that black and white photo, not see a lot of detail, but you can see the home apparently had a really large parlor, which would have been wonderful for entertaining. So next slide. This is a photo of Elizabeth and her mother and a woman named Maria Nalani Elua Jones. I was trying to figure out, this is one of the rabbit holes I was going down, trying to figure out who Maria Jones was. Elizabeth's mother died in 1911, and the funeral occurred from the home of the Kalanianaoles. So it looks like she was living with them for a while and was living with them at the time of her death. So if we move on. These are additional photos of Elizabeth with Maria. Um, the images don't tell us exactly where the photos were taken. That turtle could be a turtle that was at one time at Medio Kalani's home that apparently may have ended up with Kalanianaole or at the Honolulu Zoo. So if we go to the next photo. In 1902, Jonah Kohio Kalanianaole was elected to represent the territory of Hawaii in Washington, D.C. A man who was representing the sugar planters or just the planters in general in Honolulu was making arrangements with the White House to introduce him or to allow him to meet the president. And Teddy Roosevelt kind of balked at the name. He says, I'm not going to call him Prince. And what's his last name again? Kalania. And I'm not going to remember that name. Besides, I don't know how to pronounce it. So is there something else I can call him to make it easier on me? And so it was agreed at that point that the White House could call him Mr. Kohio or Representative Kohio, but everybody else in all the newspapers knew him as Representative or Mr. Kalanianaole, and his wife was Princess Kalanianaole. So next slide. So they apparently did quite a bit of traveling to and from Hawaii during the years he served in Washington, D.C. This is a photo of them in St. Louis in 1904. Next slide. This is a photo of them in Chicago in 1911. I used that to illustrate the South Africa story. Now, when he filled out a passport in 1887, when he was 18, he said he was 5'6". So if they're standing on the same level floor, it looks like she might be around 5 feet tall, which doesn't match with some of the stories about her that has her a rather robust woman, not large, not fat, but just robust. And that other photo I had of her from the Auckland Daily News makes her look like she's a lot taller than she looks in this photograph. And I'd love to find out or do a little more research and digging to find out what her height was. So next slide. During their time in Washington, she got to know 4 presidents: Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, and Harding. Her friendship with American statesmen and foreign diplomats, their wives and daughters, gave her a thorough understanding of politics and international affairs. She was a noted hostess, and her home in Washington and Honolulu was open to many guests. I kept looking at the Washington, D.C. newspapers, hoping to find descriptions of parties she hosted, but I would see parties she attended. I would see parties that Prince and Princess Kalanianaole attended, but no real concrete information that I truly wanted for them. There is one Washington, D.C. newspaper that talked about the time that she and her husband entertained at their Waikiki home a group of congressmen that were traveling to Hawaii to investigate the territory of Hawaii. It just says they are hosts and hostess, but does not give a lot of information about how they exactly what they were doing at the party or how they were hosting the party. They talked about the decorations, they talked about who attended, but very little meat that I was looking for. So next slide. In 1907, there was a floral parade, and this is Princess Kalanianaole on the left in the front, Liliuokalani in the middle, and it looks as though it is behind Princess Kalanianaole on the left, John Aimoku Dominus Liliuokalani's Hanai's son, and in the caption on this photo says the man to Liliuokalani's left, right rather, might be her other Hanai son, Joseph Aya. I don't know what this floral parade may have been connected to a program that it's like the group that was the Chamber of Commerce at the time, sponsored to promote tourism in Hawaii. And this is the front gate of Washington Place. You can see the flagpole kind of in the middle between both of them. So next slide, please. This is Princess Kalanianaole, Liliuokalani, and Mrs. Smithers. This photo was undated and no location was identified, but based on the background, this is not Washington Place, and it doesn't look like the lanai doors of the Kalanianaole home. But I wanted to get as many photos as I could of her so we could get a better idea of what she looked like. So next slide, please. Kamehameha Day 1914. According to one of the captions, this is the first Kamehameha Day parade. Princess Kalanianaole is in the middle. She has a hat on. She has what looks like a maili lei in her hands. It's John Aimoku Dominus to the right of her in the photograph, and then Liliuokalani. Next slide. She and her husband, or maybe just she, visited the Hawaii Island fairly frequently. That's her at Hawaiian Palace and with friends. And then the bottom one, yeah, with friends on Hawaii Island. Next slide. And again, I was looking also for shipping news because in the 1880s, you can find when people went to the outer islands, when they were passengers on the steamers, either to the other countries, to the United States, to the other islands. And by the time she was traveling in the early 20th century, there doesn't seem to be any information about when she was going and where she was going. The image on a ship is undated. It's on a trip of some sort. The former photo with her and her husband is captioned maybe 1921. This is the year before he died. So next slide, please. This is her again with a dog and the two of them with a horse. Don't know where the photo with the horse was taken. Next slide. This is an image of Kohio's funeral. He died in 1922. This looks as if it was a wake in their home. Next slide. This is at Mauna Ala. Mayor Lane has a cloak on. Princess Kalanianaole is in the middle, and her niece, Princess Kapi'olani, who was then 19, on her to the right on that. Princess Kapi'olani is standing right next to her. She was widowed at age 50 when Jonah died in 1922. So next slide. After Kuhio's death, she was appointed to the Hawaiian Homes Commission, a program he initiated during his time in Congress. In 1922, 2 years after women were granted the right to vote, she created the Hawaiian Women's Republican Auxiliary. whose mission was to educate women on political issues, methods, and procedures. She toured the island speaking to women about the importance of participating in public affairs. An eloquent and effective public speaker, she participated in Republican campaigns. I suspect she learned some of her public speaking skills when she was socializing in Washington, D.C. And one thing I forgot to mention about the Washington, D.C. period is thanks to Dre and her work with OHA, we know that she and her husband lived in a number of different locations when they were in Washington. It appears that a lot of their residences were hotels. And at one point, one of the Washington, D.C. newspapers comments which home they were renting and says it's kind of small, so they're not going to be able to entertain. They're going to have to entertain someplace else. Unfortunately, that paper didn't tell us where and when they were entertaining. So next slide. This is a description by Jack London, a gorgeous creature um, that ellipsed the handsome look of her husband. Her Highness was a trifle overwhelming to one new to the physical aristocracy of the island people. One would hesitate to call her fat. She was just big, sumptuous, bearing her splendid proportions with that remarkable pose that had already been noted in Hawaiian women. And this is why I'm thinking, I don't know what he's thinking about, because this image and the image of her in Auckland surely don't make her to be as robust and as large as he's giving one the impression that he thought she was. So next slide. She remained active in politics, even after her 1926 marriage to Frank Woods. He was described as a capitalist and as a rancher, and someone once told him he was working for a while as Prince Kalaniana Ole's secretary, private secretary, but I didn't find any evidence of that. She spent time at their home on Hawaii Island and her home on the beach in Waikiki. He died in 1930. So next slide. In 1929, and this is based on an article in a book about significant or important women in the territory of Hawaii that year. She was Mo'i of the Daughters and Sons of Hawaiian Warriors, past president of the Native Sons and Daughters of Hawaii, and honorary president of the Kalama Society. I would love to know more about that society because it's couldn't find it in the Hawaiian language newspapers or in the English language newspapers either. There's also a note that in 1915, she was hosting a meeting of the Ahahui Ka'ahumanu at her home in Waikiki. So she apparently was a member of that organization as well. So next slide. She died at Queen's Hospital, February 20th, 1932. She lay in state at her home with kahili on either side of the casket, and the royal orders that she inherited from her husband's auntie, her husband actually, and the feather cloak. The cloak was draped over the casket, and the order was pinned to her dress. She was buried at Nu'uanu Cemetery beside her second husband. And I think this might be wrong because I think she may be at Oahu Cemetery instead. I kind of took this at face value, but I shouldn't have. So go to the next slide, please. This is her headstone. Elizabeth Kalaniana Ole Woods, born in Makawao, and then died February 19th, 1932. Peace, perfect peace. Next slide, please. Many of the relics in her home, including items inherited from her husband, by her husband from his aunt Iolani, were sold at auction in 1932. This apparently is, according to the newspaper, because she and her husband spent money, but they also spent a lot of money helping people in the community. So they were not, they had a lot of debts when she died. Not when, yeah. She and her second husband had a lot of debts when she died. So one of the things that was sold at auction was this Chinese urn, which is now in her collection. So next slide. One table that she owned that was in her home, she gave to a friend who spent the summer with her. That friend went back home to Iowa and gave it to the Iowa governor's residence in 1969. When we found out it was there, and when the governor found out we were looking for it, because it appears in photos of the Iolani Palace Library, when Kalakaua was king, the governor graciously loaned it to us in 1978. In 2000, lobbying by a middle school class caused the transfer of ownership from the state of Iowa to the Friends of Iolani Palace. The loan occurred because at the time, if Iowa wanted to get rid of something, they had to auction it off, and they didn't want to risk it going to somebody else. So next slide. This again is an image of the interior of her home with some of the objects that are now part of our collection that may have come to us as a result of the auctions that occurred after her death. So next slide. I think this might be it. So this is another one of those, that's a repeat of the earlier photo. Next slide. I think that's it. So I really wish I had been able to find diaries or journals or newspaper articles that talk more about people that knew her that were talking about her. But I'm sure there is a lot out there that we probably could look for and could find. So I'm going to have to spend a little bit more time seeing if I can find more information about her. Would dearly love, as Grady was kind of commenting, to know what her favorite colors were, what flowers were in her yard. There's a dearth of information in some instances in the newspapers I was able to access. So thank you.
Thank you very, very, very much. I learned a lot, and I think we have a bunch of questions. And some you may know, and some, maybe we all need to go do some research and crawl down the rabbit hole with you.
Okay, are those questions in the chat?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Well, if it's recorded, I can go back, and a whole bunch of us can start looking at the questions and start looking for answers if I don't know where they might be.
Okay. Sure. I'll open it up for anyone if you have questions for Zita based on something that you saw, or maybe something that you're curious in about Elizabeth Kahanu that might be of interest. Any burning questions from our
Dre, this is Kama.
Hi, yes, Kama, go ahead.
Hi, Zita, thank you so much for this presentation tonight. My question, sorry, let me turn this on. My question, it kind of, I don't know if I'm going to ask it in the right way, but you noted that it was typically the prince that received all of the attention or interview time, and maybe she did not. But is there any evidence that you can find that she shared her ideas on politics or the government in any other situations, whether informal or what? I know nothing was recorded by the newspaper, but is there any other evidence that she had ideas like that or philosophies that she did share with people?
There are some repositories that I would not have been able to access because of COVID that might have that information. The newspapers, which I do not have a subscription to, the newspapers that I would have normally checked are in the library in the microfilm. One of the things I did not do when I was preparing for this presentation is pay for a subscription to newspapers.com, which would have led me to articles about her time with the Republican Women's Auxiliary, which would have given us information about that. So Republicans at the time were more like what Democrats became in the 1960s and 70s. But she was very involved in making sure women knew. So women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. So she became very involved in making sure that they knew it was important to register to vote and to be knowledgeable about the different issues so they would be able to vote for whichever candidate they felt was most representative for their ideas and their views. So that would be a source that I did not take advantage of this time or now.
And a follow, thank you so much. A follow-up question we always, I'm always interested in language, and we always note that many of our kings, queens, in the well, for them, that modern time, the late 1800s into the early 1900s, um, they spoke eloquently in English, Hawaiian, some in had fairly good command of other languages. Do you know when she, and I know it might be in those records too, but when she spoke, was there a preference as to what language she spoke in, or just to whoever the crowd was, she spoke in the language that they could understand?
I would think that would be the case, but that's one of the things I had tried to do. My cousin is with the Sacred Hearts. She's with the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts. And I have an email out to her to ask her if there is any records that she has access to that she would allow me to come look at, that would talk about the convent at the time that Princess Kalaniana Ole was a student there, so we could find out more about her education.
Thank you.
She's not
Thank
on
you.
top of it. She's
Yeah.
not on top of it always with answering questions. And also Stuart Ching, who used to work here, is an archivist, not archivist. He is with the Damien and St. Damien and St. Marianne Museum. So he may also have information about that, but connecting with people sometimes is not as time as I would like. So that would be an interesting question to find out how fluent she was in both languages. Well, she was fluent obviously in English, but how fluent was she in Hawaiian? Did she write in Hawaiian? Did she write in English? Did she speak both? I would think at small kid time it would have been Hawaiian rather than English. But her grandfather was a legislator and a judge when he died in the 1850s. One of her uncles was accompanied Queen Emma to England when she traveled to England in 1865 to try to raise money for the Episcopal Church here. So it's kind of interesting too, because I would like to find out, when did she shift her allegiance from the Catholic religion, which is what she was raised in, and to the Anglican religion, which is where she got married. So,
Thank you. Mahalo.
St. Andrew.
Zita, I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and I'm happy to share my
Okay.
login with you if it'll help.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.
Kalei Aina has a question.
Aloha, thank you so much for everything you shared with us so far. So as Dre said, there's some things that we have to come up with for the club. And given that we don't have any information yet on her favorite color or her favorite song or things like that, did you, doing your research, do you happen to know what the school color is of the Sacred Heart Convent? Or if they had a class color or something like that that we could maybe use in the interim?
That's a great idea. What we could probably check with Sacred Heart School, and I don't believe the color would have changed over the decades.
Okay.
I don't remember what it was.
Just a thought, Dre, and then maybe that might help us with a song in the meantime, or something of either the Oahu Kauai or Kauai Ali'i lines, or something relevant to Makawao, since that's where she's from.
They're
That's a great idea.
My thought on the color is, if she wore a particular color dress on a fairly regular basis, that would be a great color. But there's there was only one instance where I found a story that actually said, that even mentioned what she was wearing. And I don't remember what color garment that was, but I would hate to pick a color based on just one dress. But there may be additional descriptions, because I was focusing on her. There may be additional descriptions on the garden, her garden. So if we can look at, if I say anybody that wants to go down the rabbit hole with me could look for descriptions of Pu'alelani and find out Pu'alelani's garden and find out more about that. We could get a better idea of the flowers that she was raising.
Anyone else have questions? Shane?
No, thank you though. Appreciated the presentation, Zita. Mahalo nui. I kind of did my own little research on her when we first started, but yeah, just I think what you brought up was kind of what we found as well. I was fascinated by in their parlor there was the poi bowl or the calabash that you referred to. It was a really nice. I think that's where they stored poi because it's really tall and it kind of slenders out like that. Yeah, so I thought that was pretty fascinating. Like we don't see that style of bowls anymore. That's where they store poi and yeah,
You know,
the large
the
ones.
the large bowl in the parlor that has kamakapili on it, I don't think that was used for poi. I think it stored other things. But
Like what?
kamakapili gave that particular calabash to Kalakaua.
Hmm.
Huikuai gave a calabash, and the Nihoa Society also gave a calabash.
What would you think would be stored in those calabashes?
Um, I'm going on the testimony of people that I know that have calabashes of that size that are now in our collection or in the Washington Place collection, and it was balls, jacks, toys, dog toys, that kind of thing, rather than
Hmm.
food.
So during that era, they wouldn't use bowls for food. They would use it to store just things.
It depends on the kind of wood that it is used. If it was coal, it could have been used for food. If it was koa, it wasn't used for food.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
there's no records in the documents that we at the palace have about what Kalakaua might have used those bowls for.
Hmm.
I suspect,
Awesome.
given the kind of present it was, it might not have been used for food. It was used for what my grandmother called dust catchers.
Yeah, I think the royalty back in that era would not use wood for dishes. I think they used other things, but
Well,
yeah,
they did because when luau's were hosted, if you were foreign diplomats or in the business community and you were not part Hawaiian, you used china and flatware. If you were Hawaiian, you were seated at on the ground
yeah,
with you, and you'd use your hands. You'd eat
yeah, yeah,
regular style luau
yeah,
food.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
And
no, I
maybe
just yeah,
the guys that
interesting.
didn't like the poi would pass it on to you.
More for me.
Zita, I have a question. Early on, when we were first, like Shane was saying, doing research when we were chartering this Civic Club a couple years ago, we found a reference that suggested that Elizabeth Kahanu was in the first graduating class of the Kamehameha Schools for Girls. Did you find anything in your research that might support that?
No, I did not. She would have been married by then. Because didn't the first class graduated in 97 or later than that? But then again,
I
she
feel like
could have
I'm a
gone
bad
there. Yeah,
alumni.
yeah.
I want to say 1890-ish because the schools were founded in 87, or the school for boys was in 1887.
And I think the
And I
school
thought
for
the first, yeah, I thought it was just a few years after. Maybe I should Google.
girls was later because Louise Oy McGregor was in the first girls class. And I think that was closer to 1900.
And you said she married when she was 17, and that was in
96. No, I'm sorry. She would have been 18 or 19. She was born in 78. She married in 96. So it depends on when her birthday was in March. The wedding was in October. So she would have been 18. I did my math wrong.
Okay.
But she
Anyone
could
else
have
have a question?
she
Yeah.
could also have attended Kamehameha because there are a lot of people that attended the school that didn't go until they were older. I think my grand uncle graduated when he was in his 20s.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess age wasn't a issue. It was more just schooling. It was just
Yeah.
the idea. It had nothing like age is more of more like when we became more westernized, I guess they started to put people based on their education, based on their age, or categorizing people based on their age.
And I think a
Yeah,
lot of
that's
time, yeah, a lot of times in the 19th century, it had to do with opportunity. And if you
right.
didn't have
Yeah,
the opportunity to go when you were 12, 13, 14, but you did have when you're 17, 18, 19, that's when you went to school.
yeah, that's actually true. My grandmother's dropped out of school at ninth grade, and at Konawaina, and then she actually returned to school at on Oahu and graduated from some Cup Iolani school or something back in like 1940 something. I don't know. Yeah, yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, thanks, Zita. That helps out.
Yeah, there were a lot of photographs in your presentation that I hadn't seen before, so
Yeah,
definitely want to, collect those and put them on our Facebook and share them with our members who might not be on the call. We have a few more minutes. I just want to open up to the rest, any of our other members who might have questions. Maybe like Cedric, the Information and Community Relations Officer for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. You have, in our namesake, the one of the early members of the Hawaiian Homes Commission, which is exciting.
she should be called like the mother of Hawaiian homes, like how Kuhio's the father.
Right?
She should be the mom, right?
She should be.
Yeah.
So the question would be, are there any documents in their archives or files that talk about her conducting meetings or attending meetings or testifying elsewhere or lobbying other people for, what kind of records do they have?
Cedric, I think that was an assignment.
That's a good question.
I
I was actually gonna say that Dre probably knows more than anybody. But actually, that is a really good question to see what type of resources and/or records the department has. So I'm happy to dig into that for us.
And if you find out they were all given to the state archives, let me know, because that's next door and easy for me to pop over there and look. Because most of the work I
will
was doing, even though I'm the historian at Iolani Palace, I was doing this research on my own time, not work time. Connected, but not in the right box, so to speak.
And I really appreciated and enjoyed the presentation. It was really informative and good to learn new things about Princess Kalanianaole. Anyone else have any questions?
I did have a comment to make. Even though the White House wanted to call him Mr. Kohio, everyone else always called him Prince Kalanianaole and her Princess Kalanianaole, which makes me wonder why we today and throughout the 20th century knew him as Prince Kohio. Because when he ran for office, he was running for office as Jonah Kalanianaole. When he filed suit against Liliuokalani to get some of her inherit to be her heir, he filed suit as Kalanianaole. So really curious to know what happened there. Because she was always Princess Kalanianaole, never Princess Kohio.
All right, well, thank you again. Anyone one last question before we adjourn our meeting? Any closing remarks or comments from anyone? Going once and twice. All right, well, thank you, Zita, so much again. We'll have the recording, we'll post it online and make it available to our members. This is so interesting. When we were chartering the club in 2019, there were, longtime Hawaiian Civic Club members saying, who is that? Why are you naming, who is that? We don't know who that is, right, about Elizabeth Kahanu. And, so I think, one of the reasons that we selected her as the namesake for the club is the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs does have a rule about naming of clubs, and it either has to honor a place, honor an ali'i, or honor Kuhio. And I think, we hit two birds, right, with a single stone. We honor Kuhio by honoring his wife, and then we honor, as you pointed out, right, Elizabeth Kahanu was, from an ali'i line and had, chiefly, genealogy on her own. But, we also wanted to acknowledge, the work that gets done behind the scenes. I think you showed us like a really nice picture of her in her, I don't know if it's a study in their home, but, at the desk, like doing work. And, we really wanted to acknowledge the work that she did and the force that she provided behind her husband, Kuhio, while he did, all the things that happened during his tenure in Congress, from, the establishment of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act to, influencing the structure of county government in Hawaii as we know it, to establishing the national parks that were established during that time, and everything else that happened. And, we know that a lot of these things would not have been achieved without her presence and support. So thank you for sharing with us these lovely photos and just more background about who she was. So that we, I think are better for knowing a little bit more about Elizabeth Kahanu. So thank you so much. So with that, we'll wrap up our meeting. Zita, I don't know if you have any last words that you want to share before we log off.
And I'm sitting here thinking of all the other things I want to research and find out about her going forward. I'm really,
well, I'll email you the login to the newspapers.com.
Okay, actually, what I have waiting to find out whether, anyway, there's a book on genealogies done by Edith McKinsey, Elite Genealogies. I want to get a hold of a copy of that so I can see if I can clarify what degree of relationship she had with Queen Kapiolani, because that book should be able to identify. Found some interesting information about her dad and one of her kupuna in the ruling chief's book, but it didn't, not the lineage information I was looking for. Thank you. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Zita. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too, Rose. Rose, I know Rose because she worked at the ticket office for a